Hey everyone, and welcome to the Retro Channel, and today we're going to be playing with this Sony PS1. The plan is to throw in an X-station, which is an optical drive emulator that basically replaces the original and sometimes flaky CD-ROM drive with a more modern SD card solution. This will allow us to play games from any region or even homebrew titles. Now, the PS1 that I'm going to be using is one of the original launch models, which has the separate RCA jacks on the back. This particular one is an SCPH-1002, which is the original power release. Now, it has been talked about in certain circles that these are particularly good as an audio CD player, and that is down to the DAC that Sony used in these original launch models. Personally, I don't think it's that great. I think any standalone CD player will easily match or outclass one of these things. And yeah, I did put it through its paces. I actually had to put in a proper working disk drive because the one in this one is broken. And after doing that, I compared it with later model PS1s. And while there is a difference in audio quality, I wouldn't say it's anything spectacular. So I'm happy to sacrifice the audio playback on this PS1 in order to play any title that I want reliably. So let's crack this thing open, see what we need to do. With the screws removed, the top should just lift off. And let's remove this old laser mech, because that's not going to do us any good, and it's broken anyway. That unplugs fairly easily. We can put that to the side. And now we have a bunch more screws to remove. You can pretty much ignore everything on the power supply side. There's no reason to touch any of this. We can unplug our controller flat flex cable and unplug the cable from the power supply. And this metal shield should just lift off. I think it's normally stuck down over here, but this one has long since lost its stickiness, so don't worry about that. And here we have our main board. So this is a PU-8 revision. The X-station is compatible with the PU-7 and PU-8 boards, which are found in the 1000 series, and it's also compatible with the PU-18 boards, which are found in the 5500 series, and also certain 7000 series models, although the 7000 series that I've got has a PU-20 board, which unfortunately isn't compatible with the X-station. Now this board may look a little bit different, and that is because I've gone around and replaced all the surface mount electrolytic capacitors on the board. I found that pretty much every PS1, at least the fat model PS1s, have leaking SMD capacitors. It didn't really show up as an issue that I could see using the PS1, but certainly once removing those capacitors, it was obvious that they were leaking, and hitting them with the soldering iron, that same fishy smell came out. So I think every fat model PS1 should have their surface mount capacitors replaced at this point. They're likely to be all leaking, and while they may not show an issue yet, they're definitely going to be doing more and more damage the longer they're left on there. Speaking of capacitors, I also checked the caps on the power supply, and they are all perfectly fine. I couldn't find an issue with the capacitors in this PS1's power supply or any of the other PS1s that I have. All their power supplies seem fine, while all the SMD caps on the board were leaking. Like I said, the slim PS1s, I think I recapped one of them and found maybe one capacitor had leaked a little bit. So they definitely don't seem as bad, but it may be worth doing them as well. Oh, and just there you may be able to spot the AKM DAC. It is a Delta Sigma DAC, which is good for audio stuff. Later PS1s removed this and used a cheaper DAC, I guess, and that's kind of the way it goes with these things. The bean counters get involved and they want to reduce costs, so later models go for cheaper cost components. That's pretty much the way they did it with the PS2 as well. You had hardware compatibility with PS1 games, and that was later removed, and same goes for the PS3 and so on and so forth. Just the way it is. Let's remove these last few remaining screws so we can free up the board. Side. And we have a number of little goodies in our X-station kit. There's the quick solder board for the 55,000 series and the 1000 series. A couple of little stickers, probably won't be using them. The flat flex cable you're definitely going to need, and the X-station board itself. Oh, and a couple of little standoffs for it. Now, while it might be tempting to install the QSB first, I'd recommend leaving this till later on in the installation because once you have these soldered to the main board, it's very tricky to get them off without destroying them. So I think it's better to start out doing the other stuff first, and once you've successfully done that, then solder this bad boy on. Now, the GitHub page has a fairly detailed install guide, so definitely reference that if you get stuck. I'm going to use the microscope to do this. You don't necessarily need a microscope to perform one of these installations, but it's going to be easy to show on camera because we can get a nice close-up view of what's going on. The first thing we need to do is lift a few pins on the Sony CXD2510. They are pins 44, which is up here somewhere, 63, which is over here, 66, which is around here, and oh yeah, 69, which is over here. And I'm just going to start with just cleaning these pins off with a bit of IPA. And that pin there looks a little bit dodgy. What's happened to that? It seems to be attached. Guess it's okay. So I'm going to throw a little bit of no clean flux over here, and then using a tiny pin which has a slightly bent edge on it, I'm going to come in under pin 44, which would be this pin here. Just kind of wedge the needle in there, and with a knife tip on my soldering iron, just going to come in and heat just that pad for 44. You don't want to heat the pads next to it because then you'll end up bending those other pins out of shape. And gently sort of lever it up with the pin. It may take a couple of goes to actually separate it from the pad. You just want to make sure the solder on the pad is molten before you go trying to lift that pin up. Here it comes. And now just come in from the other side just to straighten that pin out a little bit and also sort of lift it up a bit more. And that should be it. It doesn't look like it from this view, but if we go side on, you can see that pin is clearly separated, there's no solder joining it, and the adjacent pins are perfectly fine. Now we just do the same with the rest. That might have reattached. Oh no, it is loose. That damn cap's in the way, but you can see that that pin has lifted. 2 to go. And finally, 69. Cool, that is it. Our 4 pins have been lifted. Now you could put a little bit of tape underneath these just to stop them from being pressed back down to the pads, or you could bend them up back over the chip. I'm just going to leave them as is. They're not going to be disturbed by anything inside the PS1 once it's all closed up, so I'm not too worried about it. And should anyone want to return this to its original state, at least you'll be able to push those pins back down and resolder them. I doubt anyone's going to bother, but who knows. The next thing we need to look for is the crystal oscillator, which should be sitting between the GPU and the CPU. So that guy there, and this guy over here, and our crystal is just there. So we need to remove this filter and this resistor off the board. So once again, a little bit of no clean flux, and I'm just going to apply a tiny bit of fresh solder to my tip, and we should be able to get the entire tip right on next to it. That should melt both and then lift off, and that'll come off with the soldering iron. I'm not going to bother trying to salvage these things. I'm sure if anyone really wanted to revert this back to stock, they could find replacement parts. Come on. Here you go. I'm not going to worry about cleaning anything up there, that all looks fine. And now we can move over to the underside of the board. And we need to remove these 3 resistors here. These are located in between whatever this chip is and whatever that is. So same deal, I'm just going to put a little bit of flux on there, get a tiny little bit of fresh solder on my tip, and then just come in from the side, swipe away. come here, you devil. Nice. Might just clean that up a little with some IPA. Cool. Right, finally we get to install the QSB, which sits around here somewhere. So this area here is where those 3 resistors were, so the QSB sort of sits around that area. So you can see the board mostly uses these castellation edges, which are pretty easy to solder to the pad below them with just a bit of fresh solder and flux. But there's also one through hole plated via just here, which I'm actually going to remove this for a second. And I'm just going to tin this up with some fresh solder just to help the solder flow through this hole once we're ready. So it was this guy. So just like that, I don't want to add any bulk to that pad. I just want to make it easier for the solder to connect to it once we're ready to solder this in place. So you can see the alignment won't be perfect when you first start. You just want to get them roughly in the right spot and then tack one corner in. I'm going to put a bit of flux on there, get a bit of fresh solder on my soldering iron, and then just come in. Let that flow. That was dodgy as. So we should end up with something like that. It doesn't have to look too pretty at the moment. It's just there to tack the board in place, but still allow us to move it a little bit, just so we can make sure our alignment is good elsewhere. So looks to be lining up there pretty well. That little capacitor, the alignment's about right there. You just want to go around and make sure that it's pretty close to the thing that it should join to, which should be pretty obvious. So I think next we'll go for this capacitor, which is over the opposite side of the board. So that hasn't flown onto the capacitor yet, but that's okay. I'm just going to readjust my angle. There we go. So with that tacked in, the board should now feel pretty solid. We'll just check our alignment with everything else. That should be fine. That should be good. And we shouldn't have any issues over here. Cool. So now we just tack in the rest, and then I'll come over and just touch up those first couple of solder joints. And then finally, this guy. Just drop a little bit of flux in there. And Should be good. I'll come in and clean all this flux residue up later. The last thing we need to do is just connect the IO16 pad to IO16, which is to the left of this, near all these big resistor packs here. So if you spot the 0 ohm jumper in the middle of all the resistor packs and then look left and down, you'll see a capacitor, and left and down from that is the pad we need to connect to. So I'm just going to get a little bit of fresh solder on there, just to tin that up, and a bit of fresh solder on our QSB. And then we just need a piece of wire, which is not included in the kit. So I'm just using a random bit of probably 28 gauge wire. It doesn't really need to be this thick at all. I'm just going to tin the end of this, and then we'll put a drop of flux there. Just tack that into place. Doesn't have to be super pretty as long as it's solid and you don't have excess wire hanging out. And then we move over to somewhere over here. Here it is. That's where we need to get to. So I'm just going to tin up the other end of the wire. I'll probably have to cut a little bit of excess off this. And yeah, there's definitely too much excess on that, so I'm just going to cut that back a little bit. There we go, something like that is about right. So we'll just add a little bit of flux again, and might use tweezers to get this positioned correctly. That's it, we're done. Right, that is it for the soldering part. I'm just going to give this board a little clean up, and I might actually clean up the case while I'm at it because it is kind of gross in certain areas. And we'll come back and install our flex cable and the actual X-station board itself. All right, the case has had a clean, so it should be good to go. Now we just need to install our ribbon cable into our little QSB. So with the blue side of the ribbon cable up, we need to open the little bails on the QSB, stick that in, and then close them. Just like so, and that should lock in the ribbon cable. Now you'll probably notice I have put a little fold in this, and that is because it's the second time that I'm filming this part. The first time I forgot to record the audio. But that's fine, we'll re-record it. So we do need a little fold in our cable. Basically it needs to come up across the side of the main board and just avoid the power connector here. The other thing that we need to do is with the case, we just need to clip off this post, which again, I've already done. But I do have the remnants of it, so this post normally sits right here, and I just came in with some flash cutters and just snipped it off. That will just allow the ribbon cable to run across that part without getting pinched by that standoff. So we can reinstall our bottom RF shield and stick our main board in. And then we need to route the ribbon cable through the top RF shield just like this. And once we put this over everything else, that should come through the top RF shield in this gap here, and we still have easy access to plug in the power cable. So let's get the screws back in this thing, and then we can finally install this X-station board. Right, with all the screws back in, we can finally install the X-station board. So on this model, it sits with the connector facing towards the front of the machine, and there's a couple of standoffs here that match up with these two posts here. We also need to put in some extra plastic standoffs, which are included in the kit, in a couple of these holes. I think it's this one, so the non-plated through holes, and this corner up here. Now for the older PlayStation models, you do actually need to cut these standoffs pretty much in half. So they were originally about that long. I just came in with some pliers and just snipped them in half, and that should allow it to sit neatly, the right way up, neatly over those posts. So the posts still stick through the holes, but it's not actually touching the board underneath. We can reconnect our little power connector. And finally, this ribbon cable, again, you want to connect it with the blue strip facing upwards. So open the bails on this, and this just kind of loosely bends around go into there. Once that's seated, you can close the bales, and that should hold it in place. And yeah, you don't really need to worry about putting any more bends in this. That'll sit fine as it is. Cool, we are just about ready to test this out. The only thing we need to do is prep a micro SD card. Right, over on the computer, we just want to head to the X-station GitHub page and look for the releases and just download the latest release. It is also recommended to grab the official SD Association SD card formatter, so we'll grab that too while we're at it. I'll have links to all this stuff in the video description. And with those two things downloaded, you just want to install the SD card formatter. I've already got it installed on this computer, so I won't bother doing that again. Once we open up that program, we should be greeted with this little menu, and just make sure that it's selected the right SD card in your computer, and then just hit format. And now we can copy across the files from the X-station GitHub. We just need to create a new folder on our SD card, which is called 00 X-station. And then just copy over the files from the zip file from the GitHub page into that 00 X-station folder. And that is it. Now you can just add whatever ROMs you have. I think the X-station only works with bin.q files, and I think it works with ISOs as well, but it doesn't work with any of those other compressed formats. Now I'd recommend just putting each title in its own separate folder just to keep everything neat. You can put everything in the root directory if you really want to, but just different folders just keeps everything nice and neat, especially when you've got multiple bin.q files for just one game. Once you've copied everything across, we can now put our micro SD card in the X-station. So these have a little clicky SD card slot, so clicks in and clicks out. And that should be it. Let's power this thing up with the cover off just so we can test it out, make sure it's working properly. All right, let's plug in power. Obviously, make sure you don't go poking your fingers in the power supply, just touching the power switch is fine. And our PS1 is still working, so that's always a good sign. Now you'll notice it's just gone straight to the regular menu, and that is because the top cover is off, so it thinks the disk drive is open, in which case the X-station is not active. Even though there is a little power indicator light on there, the access light is turned off. So if we trick it into thinking the CD cover is closed, stick that in the little switch, it should start to boot the X-station. Here we go. And on first power on, you'll have no games in the list. You just need to press triangle and head down to refresh games list. And there we go. That's everything I've got on the SD card at the moment. There are some other options in here that you can play around with. Nothing too exciting really, unless it's Christmas. And yeah, that is pretty much it. So you can just select whatever game you want to load up. You can either do a fast load or a full load. The fast load just tries to skip some of the copyright warnings and intros, that kind of stuff, just to get you to the game quicker. Sometimes it works, it's a bit hit and miss. Either way, you'll end up with the game that you want to play. And that is pretty much it for the X-station install. Now, keep in mind you're not going to see a significant speed boost with this thing. It's still limited by the rest of the PlayStation hardware, which is expecting to see a 2-speed CD-ROM drive, I think it is. So you're not going to see any massive performance increases. You might see a little bit for games that have to access different parts of the disk a lot, because you obviously don't have a moving laser in this. But apart from that, there's no huge performance games. There's maybe, I don't know, less than 10%. So, with that confirmed working, let's put the top cover back on, which should just sit neatly over here. This stupid thing wouldn't fucking get... Yeah. And we can put the screws back in. Cool, that is it. Our X-station is installed. There are 3D printable mounts for this thing, which makes it look a little bit neater. I'll sort that out later because my 3D printer is a piece of shit. And now that we have the cover back on, this should boot straight into the X-station loader. Cool. And there we are. I'm yet to get some more PS1 titles, so there's only a small selection here. Feel free to leave any suggestions in the comments section for good games that I should look at. Of course, I do have the 240p test suite. I think this is an unofficial version. I don't think there's an official one for the PS1, but this one seems to do the job. Who said there wasn't any homebrew for the PS1? So we can easily jump in and fire up my favorite game. And there we go. Now, a quick push of the reset button will boot you back into the same game that you previously loaded. Just like so. And a long press will bring you back to the original X-station loader menu. Cool, and that is it for the X-station install in this very early model PS1. Now I do have some further ideas for mods for this thing, so maybe one of those will redeem me amongst the audiophile community, but we'll have to see about that in a future episode. So that is it for this one. Thank you all for watching. A huge thanks to the people that support the channel on Patreon, and if you want to do the same, links to all that are down in the video description. Of course, be sure to check the GitHub page if you are installing one of these, because there is different install guides depending on your model, and there could also be, future updates to the install instructions. But yeah, that is it. I'm going to play around with this a little bit more, but so far it's been rock solid. So yeah, I can definitely recommend one of these if you're looking to replace the flaky optical drive. All right, I've babbled on enough. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Grand Theft Auto.
Missed him. The first thing we need to do is lift a few pins on the Sony CXD 2510 Choice Brew.